impact on the electricity sector, which can be seen on the performance of the energy utility providers as well as on every individual in an economy. The country's electricity sector performance has shown a tremendous improvement to ensure full access to electricity to the consumers, and is also introducing important energy pricing reforms in the coal, oil, gas, and electricity sectors, which are fundamental to further opening the energy market and improving its financial health. However, the economy is also facing several tariff-related issues that affect the ability of distribution companies to buy power to supply to the consumers. The tariff determination process is of utmost importance and can have different impacts on electricity tariffs in an economy. For efficient determination of electricity tariffs, the regulators need to analyze several elements such as the utility costs, performance, structure, and subsidies involved. On the same lines, Dr. Pradyumna, our esteemed speaker of the day, will be speaking on dynamic retail electricity tariffs, choices, and barriers, where he will elaborate the elements involved in the determination of electricity tariff, its taxonomy, and other related aspects. So we are very happy and we are honored to have you with us. A brief introduction about Dr. Pradyumna Bhagwat, who is an energy policy and regulation expert. He is the head of research at the Florence School of Regulation, Italy, Global Initiative. He has led research projects on a wide range of topics such as dynamic tariffs, offshore wind electric vehicles, and capacity mechanisms. His work has been published in leading academic journals, book chapters, reports, and policy briefs. Dr. Pradyumna received his PhD in November 2016 at Delft University of Technology, jointly with KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, and the Universidad, sorry for my pronunciation, at Madrid. He has a European Joint Masters in Management and Engineering of Environment and Energy, ME3 program 2011, and a Bachelor of Engineering Mechanical from the University of Mumbai 2009. With these words, I again welcome all our esteemed participants and Dr. Bhagwat, and I request you to please take over, sir, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abba. I hope everyone can hear me well. Can you share the slides as well so we can start? But before we get into the presentation and the workshop that we are doing today, I would like to thank Dr. Abha, Ritu, and FOIR, IICA for having this workshop. And it's indeed very interesting that you had even more different workshops before in the past few weeks on very different and varied topics. Another great thing is you're bringing together regulators from different verticals, which makes it actually harder for a presenter to decide what to put in and what not to. But at the same time, it leads to a lot of sharing of values, sharing of information, data, and sharing of best practices. Some of which, for instance, would help us in the future as we move towards a more coupled sector in terms of mobility and electricity, or information technology and electricity, among others. And we will see regulators who worked in silos for many years to have to interact now with each other and learn from each other's experiences, as well as include in each other's work within their own. For a very simple example is the EV charging infrastructure, which we worked on in the past, or battery storage. So I was sitting a few days ago thinking, what should I present? Because we have really esteemed people. I see a lot of names here who have in the past who know a lot more about many things from the ground. As you see, Ms. Nair is here. So sorry, I have a echo in the background. Okay. Hello?
Requesting everyone to. I'll have to please switch off.
All right, I think it works now. Cheers. So we are going to see a lot more interaction between regulators. Okay.
Uh, Sir, could you please turn your mic on?
I got muted. Okay, so I was saying that today the topic that we are going to talk about today is something which is very sector specific in a way, but at the same time has a lot of relevance for various other sectors such as oil and natural gas. Natural gas for sure, with pipes and the new gas exchange that's come up, etc., as well as even maybe for the ICT and the telecom sector, because they are actually much more advanced in terms of tariffs and the discussion on retail competition going up and down and having a vibrant retail market to coming down to the big four and everything. So with that short introduction, I am going to I'm going to do is I'm going to give a presentation of about 30 to 40 minutes, and then would love to even listen to views of other experts who are sitting in the room who know a lot about these topics, and also answer some of your questions. It would be good if you already have some quick questions. It would be good to have them in already in the chat box, so I can take them up as we go on, or if they're relevant to a particular slide. Uh, that would make life a lot easier for me. Um, okay, so when I was preparing for this presentation, I was thinking, where should I begin and where should I stop? Should I start with really academic fundamental basis? Should I explain? Because there are students, there's a mix from students to chairs of regulatory commissions who know a lot about tariff design. So I said, let's go a step down and see what the people know, the layman, what's happening. And I saw some interesting news. One was about the bill shock, which is a recent issue that's going on in India, and you can see that it's affecting everybody's life. You have Bollywood actors tweeting about it. You have regular residents of societies who are taking out marches and protesting outside the DISCOM offices in Mumbai. But at the same time, on the other side, you have some cities. I just took two here in New Delhi, which has free electricity up to 200 units, and I believe it's something which has, apart from the economic or the socio-economic value that it added, it also had a political impact on elections and everything. But that's not our topic for today. But what I would like to show here is that retail tariffs is something that affects the lowest common denominator on the supply side, which is the consumer itself. And that takes me to what I would talk about today, which the context of this webinar in many senses would be electricity tariff at the household and the small consumer or retail level. And why do I need to delineate this is because the tariff itself is the colloquial khichdi of topics. It has on one side the differentiation on the consumers being from high voltage, medium voltage, low voltage, residential consumers, commercial consumers, etc. On while it also has a very vertically delineated structure where can it be for transmission, distribution, the full retail, only retail, distribution and retail, how it affects the generator on the other side, how are the contracts with the generators decided? Are they short-term wholesale market contracts or are they long-term PPAs? So it's a melange of topics together, and it's very important that when you have a 1 hour focused discussion to focus on a small part of it. And I picked smaller household consumers for a very simple reason, because in India, as I see, and most of you would agree, is that we already have some level of dynamic tariffs in terms of time of use. I'll come to that in a second for the people who are uninitiated in it. But at the same time, at the industrial level or the high tension level, but we are still looking at what can be done at a retail and a household or a small consumer level, and that I think is the future. And a lot of time we get stuck talking about topics which are current without really looking into the future. And once you look into the future, you sometimes find solutions for problems that you're looking at today. Having said that, we should also understand that electricity is a very unique sort of product. It be stored like gas or oil. I mean, yes, you saw the whole crash of because there was not enough storage. but it cannot be stored. Batteries are coming in still in the early stages, still in discussion stages, tests. It has to be used as soon as it's produced. That gives it a very special and unique sort of place in the world of markets or in the world of neoliberal economics, and then that exactly is what impacts tariff and tariff design, because on one side it is a very dynamic and a very unique product. On the other side, it is also a social infrastructure, which is something that goes after the roti kapda makan sort of discussion, that now it's internet and electricity that every person on the street and at home needs to be given. So what can we talk about next? Oh, sorry, I went one too quickly. So the next step I did in my research for this is because Dr. Abha has said that we have to have an Indian component to it. So I said I will pick up a bill from my parents and check what sort of components do we have. To understand, basically this is to understand that how complex electricity retail tariff setting is, what are the different parameters that are used, and what can we really make dynamic or get most value out of by making dynamic. So here, of course, maybe these prices are skewed based on my parents' consumption, but I see that 60% the colors don't match. So 60% of the cost is the energy charge. What is the energy charge? The energy charge is the price that the distribution retail joint company is paying for buying electricity. So this can be power purchase agreements, or this can be from the wholesale market, etc. And then there are other taxes and levies. And in general, you can say that there is the energy component, the transmission distribution component, and then there is the taxes and levies and other components, right? So that makes up that really actually makes up the components of electricity retail tariffs at a household level, for instance. But what do we have to talk about or discuss here is the dynamics. But before we get into dynamics, I think it's important that we speak a bit about, at least theoretically, what are the rate making principles. This is not really the focus of the whole discussion today, but it's something that is important to know before you can talk about barriers and choices that regulators have. Because the primary role of the regulator, at least I think in India also, is, or one of the primary roles is to make tariff designs, or rather set tariffs. I promise that this will be a very short thing for the ones who know all about it, and as informative as possible for the others who do not know this. So rate making can be divided into 8 principles. This comes from the book on regulation of the power sector by Ignacio Perez Arriaga. At least when I was in my working experience and education, this is sort of the Bible, Gita, Quran, whatever of electricity policy and regulation, covering everything from generation right up to retail. And in that, they have a whole section, and this comes in actually the distribution tariff design sort of chapter, but it actually impacts, and it also is useful for all sorts of tariff designs, depending on the market structure, the regulatory framework that we have in our country. So the 8, as you can see on the board, there are 8 principles. Let's go through them. And the best thing about working from home is that you can have notes. So I have notes about 8 of them, which I went through, and I structured them according to sort of what would be most relevant, right? So we can start by the bottom left one, sustainability. And this is something which has been a discussion for many years in India about the distribution health, distribution company health, something that hopefully would be resolved with the new amendments to the Electricity Act with DBT and clean balance sheets. But what does sustainability means? While designing a tariff, you have to always remember, and this is something Mr. Garg, I think Mr. Shroff said at the beginning of this presentation when he introduced himself, is that on the backside, there is always a generation company, an organization which needs to invest in more infrastructure. It needs to invest in its people, in innovation, in operating the system, and these sort of things all need to be considered while creating or making rates, so as to make sure that the company is stable and a little bit of profit as well, because it needs to pay it's a well generating company if it's a private enterprise, so private enterprise has to make a little bit of profit. So the sustainability of the companies behind produce supply of electricity really needs to be considered and kept in mind while designing rates. Of course, there is a element of political economy that comes in, which should be avoided as much as possible, and that's why we have independent regulators across the country in terms of state and national regulators. Kudos to them for working very hard on doing this in the coming years. The second most important point you can see is economic efficiency for rate making. What does this mean? In general, economic efficiency would mean that the goods should be consumed by the consumer who benefits the most from it, right? So what it means is, on a general scale, all value should be taken into account in terms of costs and benefits while designing the tariff, so that you minimize, you go as close as possible to the marginal cost in a way that it is very sorry, in a way that the consumer that needs the electricity the most or is going to get the most value out of it will be able to use it, and the least and the cost should be also designed in such a way that the generator with the least cost should be able to produce it. So in turn, you have a economical efficient system. At a system level, you have economic efficiency, excuse me. Then comes something which is very important, right? Top, equity. That has nothing to do with equity in terms of investment, but equity in terms of non-discriminatory access. So every single consumer or who needs electricity should be provided with electricity, and every generator should be provided access to provide this electricity to whoever wants it. But what does the tariff design come in? Where does the tariff design come in? The tariff design here comes in a way which says that you should pay for what you consume, and there shouldn't be any discrimination in terms of what you pay based on who you are. But equity is a very difficult principle to apply, because there is a lot of social issues, and there is a lot of again political economy, which makes you delineate different consumer types. It makes you delineate different rates, of course, but whenever within the consumer type, as soon as you get some level of low granularity, you should immediately put equity in place so that different consumers within that category pay equally, and there is not much discrimination there. Then, of course, there's transparency. Transparency is a very clear principle which says that the methodology used for setting the rates should be made transparent. The extreme case of this would be making the methods and everything open source and open access. So anybody who wants to see how a rate is set is allowed to see it without any problem. Then comes to tariff additivity, which is a sum total of all the other issues that we spoke about. That so average cost of service. So the cost added should together be equal to the cost that is incurred by the distribution company in procuring this electricity. Then we come to 2 points which are very important for regulators. One is stability. Regulators should try and reduce regulatory uncertainties by staying close to the regulatory framework in place. And the third and last point here is consistency. Consistency means that we are at different stages of liberalization, and the tariff design should be consistent with the structure of liberalization that we have, or the structure of vertical integration that we have. And this sounds very easy to do, but maybe it's quite difficult when you have to sit down and create rates. So these are the 8 guiding principles I see, which of course lead to the number a value that you put on any tariff. And of course, there would be, I'm sure, a lot of questions and a lot of things which our regulators here would say about this. But I would say that then you deviate from these 8 and you make flexible needs as and when required, right? So what do we have here is we have a number. We have a number which is 5 rupees, 8 rupees, 20 rupees per unit. But what we are going to talk about is something different. We are going to just leave aside the number itself, the rate, but we are going to talk about other market design and choices and barriers that exist, which regulators need to keep in mind while designing retail tariffs. So within retail tariffs, we can have a taxonomy. One can be static tariffs. Static tariffs are basically there's one number like €5, 5 rupees, 7 rupees, 10 rupees, and that stays throughout your 24 hours, throughout your 365 days, throughout your weekends. There is no change. You pay that if you use 1 unit of electricity. Very simple baseline being used. Then we move to dynamic tariffs. And why is it important? Because I see a lot of time there's a confusion with regards to the taxonomy of dynamic tariffs and rather the taxonomy of retail tariffs. Because the word time of use and the word dynamic tariffs and the word time varying tariffs is all mixed and used together. So I would like to clarify here that the broader view is that there is in literature and across globally as it's used is that there is something called dynamic tariffs, which has another name, which is time varying tariffs. And time of use by itself, and I'll come to that, is a type of dynamic tariff, right? So here I've written a definition of dynamic tariffs. It's tariff that varies in time to provide an economic signal that encourages consumer to change their patterns to reach a socio-economic optimal use of electricity. So as you see that it goes back to your principle of optimal use of electricity, right? And so dynamic tariffs themselves consist or consider a lot of those 8 principles that we discussed right now. So this is the basic taxonomy that we need to understand before we even talk about using dynamic tariffs in practice. So what do we have within that? The most commonly used, the most commonly spoken about is the time of use tariff. And let me see if I can make a drawing here with a pencil to show. So there's a whiteboard somewhere, right?
Yes, on the top.
How do I connect to the whiteboard? I just do pencil and that's it. Perfect. So let's see, time of use tariff. So I'm going to draw, I'm very bad at drawing. So what would happen in time of use tariff? We'll have a price here and we will have time here. And this is probably 24, say. So we have 24 hours in a day and we have a price. What happens in a time of use is that you create a block and say that this block will have a different price as compared to another block. And then maybe you can have one more block here, which has a different price, and then the rest. So what does this do? It means that you have something which is called peak price for a particular hours during the day and an off-peak price for particular hours during the day. The price is decided based on what we discussed earlier. But what you need to see here is that during a whole day, you will have 2 or 3 time blocks, and within this time block, you will have a price set. Very basic of what should be called time of use tariff. Then we can have the second one, which is critical peak pricing, which is another type of dynamic tariff. Oh, now I can draw better. So in critical peak pricing, what happens is you have a single price, and there are critical times during the day or during the year when the price will rise, and the rest it will stay the same. So critical peak pricing can be of different types. It can be variable or it can be static. And the difference between this and time of use is that at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the season, the regulator will define that there are particular hot or cold days when we will have higher price, or few hot or cold hours within the few hot or cold days, which will have a particular high price, which gives the incentive for the consumer to reduce its use, so turn off the air conditioner when the temperature goes to 42 degrees, for instance. And and reduce its consumption and reduce its energy cost. And this, so now you can see why I said this was a melange or a khichdi of topics, because already you see here that we have two dimensions, which is day, so number of hours, and then we can say over a season or over a year that you can have these critical peaks. Then there is something called a critical peak rebate. What does a critical peak rebate do? It's very difficult to draw, but I would say put it like this at the bottom. So instead of critical peak price, they would say that for reducing your electricity consumption during a particular hour of the year or of the day, you will be given a refund or a rebate in money. So that's another way to structure dynamic in tariffs. And then finally, we have the most complex and the most interesting one indeed, which is called the real-time pricing. So in the real-time pricing, what happens is the price changes according to the wholesale market. So it can be 15 minutes, it can be 30 minutes, it can be 1 hour, depending on how often the wholesale market clears. And what are you doing in real-time pricing till now, as you see across the world from experiences, is that you're converting or you're passing on the signals from the whole short-term wholesale markets to the consumer at the end. But why? What makes this difficult? This is made difficult by the fact that you need to have a vibrant wholesale market to have that sort of price signals. Or else, if you have long-term power purchase agreements, and I'll come to this later, and then you put dynamic, really real-time pricing, you're not going to have any, and you link it to, say, for instance, the Indian exchanges, PXIL or IEX. You're not going to have any impact on the distribution company itself because its cost would remain the same as what they get from the long-term PPA. So this is something that needs to be taken into account while structuring or going in for ambitious and complex dynamic tariff structures. Can we go back to the slide, please? To the presentation. Thank you. So now here you see this is the taxonomy of retail tariffs. Your static dynamic tariffs, and you have 4 basic kinds of dynamic tariffs. So now within this, of course, you can have a lot of customization based on where you are, what is your country, what sort of regulations you have, what sort of organization level you have, etc. So going deeper into the reasons for applying dynamic tariffs, why do we need to apply dynamic tariffs? And here I took 2 reasons which I find are the most relevant for India, which is one is integrating non-dispatchable renewables, and along with it some DER, which is going to be distributed like rooftop solar, and also electric vehicles. Because sometimes electric vehicles would also create a lot of dynamic, being power dense, dynamic in time and dynamic in location system. It's going to have different sort of issues for the grid, and this is what I've discussed. It's a different topic and I can talk about it for an hour itself, and we worked on this often. And the second being increase in peak demand. We don't have storage yet, so these issues don't consider that we might have massive storage in the future. Integrating rapidly growing non-dispatchable renewables. What are the market implications? Market implications are straightforward. You see that supply and demand wouldn't match because at peak there might not be enough supply as the renewables might not be sufficient. And there are going to be valleys and troughs, and if there is a trough in the renewables, then you would have very expensive power plants which are and also emitting power plants which would be participating in the market and generating electricity, making really wasting the renewable that is being generated at base load. Second, there's a network implication that there's always the issue of congestion and grid services when you have a massive peak, and then that needs to be resolved. And you should, and in the spirit of, okay, I have a question here from Mr. Gupta. health for normal domestic consumers, poor customers. I'll come to this. I think this I should answer. I should take at the end because it's a very interesting question, loaded question, very interesting. But I'll take it at the end. Uh, so here we are from the spirit of COVID. There are a lot of issues which come in with renewables for markets, for networks, but we are looking at what can be resolved using a medicine which is called dynamic tariff. So there can be various other things that can be there, but the key point here is we have to keep the focus on dynamic tariffs. So what is the solution? Solution is flexible demand and flexible generation resources. Flexible generation resources is something we keep out because now we are trying to um, find a solution for integrating renewables. So that means we can make demand flexible, and that's where dynamic tariffs can provide an economic signal to shift load from high renewable times to times of low renewable, or which would actually help with even with grid operations, that your peaks would be shaved, as you will see in the next slide. So increase in peak demand. So as we have more and more electrification of them, and as like I said, from industry right up to electric vehicles, right up to other things, one of the big market implications is that there is more and more need for generation during the peak. I'm talking in general. It might change with time. It might change with countries and contexts. But we have more investment, and that requires investment not only in new capacity on the generation side, but when you look at the network implications of it, you might have to design your grid as it is a standard procedure. You have to process, I think, to design your grid for the peak. What does this do? If you have very extreme peaks and off peaks, you have a over designed grid, and you're spending a lot of money, investing a lot in your regulated asset base, which can be saved actually by storage being one solution for it, but also by using dynamic tariffs as a way of shifting load away from peak. And that would also mean that investment for peak is not needed. I mean, I think in India we have more generation capacity than our peak requires, but if the peak continues to grow, you need to continue to invest in generation as well. So here a cost benefit analysis can be done to see that if you have dynamic tariffs, how much can you shift load so that you can reduce your need for investment in generation and also in grid capacity, and basically making the grid more efficient. So those are the two key issues that we see, and recently we worked on a small research on identifying these barriers, and by looking at different countries that are different countries around the world who have invested or have included dynamic tariffs at a retail household level. These are 16 countries. As you can see, it's Europe heavy because they are at a forefront of market liberalization, as well as at applying these sort of innovative tariff designs and other impacts. Even during the COVID, they have a new green plan, which is an industrial policy which says they should invest more and they should have more sustainable electricity. But that's a different story altogether. Then there's United States, again, three states from the US and also Brazil, which did have something called the white tariffs, or which does have, and which is a country which is quite comparable to India in terms of size, in terms of the regulatory structure it has, and in terms of how the government and the regulation and the industry functions. Interestingly, it's so far away, but it's very close. When I work with them, I realize this. And then you have more countries. Japan, who's always a leader in Asia. Australia is an advanced market. And another country which comes under the BRICS is South Africa, and South Africa too has experimented with dynamic tariffs for retail consumers, and they have their own interesting examples, but they actually have a vertically integrated utility doing this also. But I think generation has been made competitive. So after looking at all these countries and all these cases, I would say markets, because as some are states, some are countries, uh, we found that there were two primary design choices, right? So these two primary design choices are one, and these are the ones which shift with time. So one is the time block length. What does the time block length mean? Like I explained to you with the whiteboard, we have to cut up the whole day or the whole year into blocks of time and put a price for each of this block. So the first is how big this block is. For a time of use with only peak and off-peak prices, you would have just two time blocks, right? But for a real-time price, you will have time blocks which are equivalent to how often does your short-term wholesale market clears. And then on the other side, we have price periodicity. Price periodicity is how often are the prices of these blocks updated. So this is why is this important? Because this gives regulatory certainty and a sort of certainty to the consumer. So at one point you can take this static price where the price is set at the starting of the regulatory period and it stays the same, maybe 1 year, maybe 4 years, depends. Or you can go to the other extreme, which is the renewable price, which is the real-time price, which can change with the wholesale market every 15 or 20 minutes. So when you go deeper into this, what do you see what's happening in the countries? You see that one size does not fit all, as you can see here, and there is no trend as well. But I would try to go through this with you together and see what sort of trends or what sort of feedback can we get. Let's start from the rightmost column, which is the high periodicity and short time blocks. As you can see, this has 4 Scandinavian countries in it: Estonia, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and also the United Kingdom. So they have real-time pricing. So in the UK, they have a lot of different pricing, but they also have real-time pricing. So here we have looked at the most advanced dynamic price in these countries. In the UK, there is Octopus Energy, which is doing this, and similarly Vattenfall in some of the other Scandinavian countries. So what we need to remember here is that they pass on the price from the wholesale market, the Nord Pool clearing, directly to the consumer. So the energy price is what is dynamic. And in the future, they want to even make the grid tariffs and also dynamic. So to get more value out of this and to include that in the price setting. Remember, these are extremely advanced markets with a lot of liberalization, a lot of competition. The wholesale market is extremely vibrant, so the dynamics from there impact the retailers. Then you can go a bit more to the left. You see there are some countries like Portugal, South Africa, which are using time of use with two blocks, and the price set adjustment is moderate. So they would change the price every season, for instance. And if you go below there, you'll see Brazil, for instance, and I don't remember the second flag because I'm not good with flags, but it is one of the Australian states where they also have 2 time blocks, so peak and off peak, but the price periodicity or adjustment is low. Like I said, it's set once every year, for instance. Going more to the left, I would say in terms of dynamic tariff, Japan just did a test. So it just had 2 blocks and low periodicity, but it was a test done by a company called Loop, which is a retailer. And then you have going up from there, 2 time blocks. Sorry, there is a typo here. The California, Portugal, South Africa, they have 3 time blocks. So peak, off peak, and they have something called the shoulder. But on the left, you have some states of Australia and the US which have 2 time blocks and moderate power adjustment. But again, you see a huge chunk of these are all time of use tariffs and not really extremely complicated critical peak price. There is 1 or 2 critical peak pricing available, or critical peak rebate, as is the case in the US. And then France had a very unique case where they had time of use, so they had different blocks, but then they had one more step where they had some days during the year which would be critical. So they had a combination of time of use and critical peak pricing. So that's why they have price periodicity which is high, with a lot of possibly changing of prices very quickly, but also time of use. So a bit to the left in terms of time block length. In general, the key message from here is looking at countries who have experimented or are working with this. We see that one price or one style doesn't fit all. We are somewhere, I think, what is useful for us is to look at South Africa and Brazil as we see right now from an Indian perspective. They are countries with similar economies, similar liberalization levels and structures, and move more towards. So we see a move which goes from the bottom left to the top right, upwards, like how we would want all the markets to be going. Then we come to implementation choices. So now we finished two fundamental market design choices. So we have made a choice, say, of what time block we want to have and what sort of time frequency we want to have. Hypothetically, say we took a time of use of peak and shoulder, and we say the prices would be set every 6 months. What does the regulator have to decide next? And what does the consumer have to decide next? So there are the choices which are in terms of the regulator and choices which are in terms of the consumer. The regulator has two choices, or the most important choice that he has to make is how to protect vulnerable customers. This can be done in different ways. You can have, as you can see on the right, I have put a summary of different regulatory interventions that have been made. So you can have a last resort supplier. So anybody who doesn't have a contract with a competitive supplier or with a dynamic tariff gets a flat last resort tariff. And generally these tariffs, mind you, are set higher. So to encourage more and more consumers to switch and to go into retail competition. There can be also retail price caps like that have been included in the UK, and for it, the UK actually has a last resort supplier as well as a retail price. And then the third point and third way to do this is subsidy for the poor, something I think India, we are very used to and we know how this works, which is used in France for some poor consumers to get money into their bank accounts. This is interesting because now with DBT we will have something similar where everybody pays the price and then gets the refund back in their bank account. I think it's a very, very good move, and I hope it passes, the bill passes with this amendment intact. Then we come to consumer choices. Consumer choices are of two levels, and this is again important for the regulators because it actually decides how much choice to give to the consumer. So there is first the opt-in and opt-out, which is the higher level, where you ask the consumer, do you need or do you want to be part of this dynamic tariff story or not? So either you can say everybody goes to dynamic tariff as it was done in Italy. And I can tell you a very nice anecdote. In Florence, I was shifting houses recently to come to India, and I had to meet my house landlord. She's an old lady, 70-year-old, very sweet person, and we had to take the bill reading. So for this we went. So she comes up and rings the bell and she says, "Prat, I'm not able to take the readings." I'm like, "Why? What happened?" It's just the machine. She's like, "They changed all the meters, and now I don't understand what it is." And then when I went out, I realized, and then it linked in my head that Italy made a dynamic tariff, time of use tariff as a fundamental change. So it was everybody was opted in, and all the meters were changed to include dynamic tariffs. And so that was the first time I actually could press the buttons and take meter readings for peak, off peak, and shoulder load. So that's one way of doing it, that where you regulatorily say that everybody goes to dynamic tariffs at we are talking household levels, right? And then maybe some sort of an opt-out or some sort of an default tariff for them. Or you can have the other way, which is opt-in, where you ask, will you tell the consumer you have a choice? If you want dynamic tariffs, you can save money and get into it. Then you go to the next level, which is menu of tariffs, as I've written here. What is menu of tariffs? How much choice are you giving to the consumer in terms of customizing the pricing that he gets to his needs? Important to know here is that having retail competition, as is the case in most countries that we looked, except California, where it's suspended, what you can see is that the more competition can be an retail competition, which is delinking of carriage and content, as is said in India, is a very good is an enabler for this, having more choice. So you have more competition in the market. Each new regulator is giving, oh, nice signature. Each new regulator is giving. Oh, sorry, not regulated. I got distracted by the board. Each new retailer is providing a different set of tariffs, different prices, different choices, flexibilities to its consumer, and this can really help. But it also depends on what your regulatory and policy decisions are. Do you want the consumers to have more choice, or do you want this to be done by the regulator? Because you can also have a single entity with a lot of options within it. So these are the two key choices that need to be made. And finally, there are still barriers while implementing which needs to be kept in mind, especially when you want to choose and decide to go towards really complex and I mean, real-time pricing seems very attractive and seems cool, but do we have the physical and ICT infrastructure required? Say, we need to have smart meters, really smart meters. We need to have smart infrastructure in terms of smart grids. If you're going to if you're going to include also the grid congestion costs in designing your dynamic tariff. So here I'm considering a distribution and retail company which is together or separated, like in Sweden, which they're going to consider soon, which is even the grid tariffs will become dynamic, and it will be included in the retail price. And and the third is interface with the consumer. So if you're going for really quick changing prices, as a price change is very quick, it has to be we need to have applications in which the consumer is given. We need to have more uh, digitalization to make sure that or AI, for instance, so that efficiency are improved and the consumer has all the information to make a choice when he wants to turn on and turn off their equipment. And a good example of this is Alexa or smart homes, where this will be all set up automatically, and a refrigerator or a washing machine or an air conditioner will shut down by itself for a few minutes when the price goes up, and then it will turn on again. Futuristic, but actually it's not that futuristic. It happens in many countries, and I am sure it will come to India very, very soon, before we know it. I got to see this in the Linky lab of NEDs in Paris, and it's amazing. The second one was market arrangement requirements. So, like I said, some of these more advanced dynamic tariffs to really work and to have any positive impact need to have the market arrangements at the backside, such as vibrant short-term wholesale markets, or structures have to be put into place. And the third barrier is consumer behavior. And this is, I think, the most important barrier, especially in a massive subcontinent-sized country like India, is that the message of why we are doing dynamic tariff has to reach the consumer, or else the consumer will just continue to use the electricity as he or she wants, thinking, okay, I'm just going to use it. Arey, sarkar ne price change kar diya. And we don't. That's not how it should be. We need to inform consumers that if you change your behavior, if you don't use your electricity at a particular time during the day, you're going to save money. And this saving has to be sufficient. That is again relative, right? It has to be sufficient to encourage consumers to shift or to change their behavior. For instance, it would also depend on the socio-economic categories as well as the industrial categories. That sometimes if the industry might find it value in even saving 1 rupee for 2 hours a day, while a rich household might not, and while a poor household might. And so these are considering that we are not having free subsidy for electricity for the poor households, and that everybody pays and you have DBT. So in that sort of a case. But if you have subsidy, again, the moment you put subsidy, you're taking away the impact of dynamic tariffs fully. So these are the sort of implementation barriers that exist and that need to be considered while we even think about having dynamic tariffs. And this, with this, I think I thought I would summarize some key insights for regulators as we are in a FOIR meeting, and put them down out there. One, we saw that TOU seems to be the first step. Sorry, so let's start with that. So there is variation in the dimensions of an implementation choices. Time of use seems to be the first step in moving towards more dynamics in tariff design or in tariff structures. And that should be done before you even consider more advanced approaches, uh, and slowly move towards these advanced approaches. Regulatory intervention may be required, so regulators need to watch carefully to make sure that the vulnerable and poor customers are protected. Consumer choices, what I discussed quite in depth, of two levels need to be considered by regulators. Another point is retail competition, carriage content delineation is an enabler. You put it in and consumers can have much more choice and according to their needs. What needs to be done before any, as the first step, is to do an ex-ante cost benefit analysis to see from the generator perspective, from the distribution company perspective, from the system perspective, from the consumer perspective, what are the costs, what are the benefits, and are the costs, and this, I would call this as a social cost benefit analysis that needs to be conducted to make sure that we know that that overall there is a benefit to the system of having these, or else it's pointless doing something. And finally, something that needs to be done is keep innovative business models and technologies and encourage them and make them push startups to work with, for instance, discoms on these sort of things to understand consumer behavior and enable it. These were my key interventions. I will take the question of Mr. Gupta now for quickly, and then we can open the floor to discussion. So the question is, will real-time prices or dynamic tariff structure help normal domestic customers or poor consumers in India? How consumers will be able to budget their electricity expenses in case of dynamic pricing? Okay, very nice question. I tried to answer it a bit during the presentation itself, but dynamic tariffs can help domestic consumers, because if the pricing is set correct, what you would see is that consumers can then save on their electricity bills significantly by shifting loads to times where prices are low. So this is one way of doing it, and it has a lot of with the new RPOs, for instance, also that are coming in. You need this renewable energy to be used, and you will see from the distribution company perspective also that then these RPOs can be executed, and they're just not on paper. For the poor consumer, it's a, like I said, there are a lot of different political economy issues that need to be taken into account. One of the most important being subsidies. How are subsidies being disbursed? Um, the poorest are the most positively impacted many times, because for them moving that 1 hour and is a lot of savings, and especially if you are in a bracket which is not low enough to get the subsidy, but you are still not extremely well off, is the scene which would or is the piece of the pie which would be positively impacted, as these people would really, I would expect them to become much more sensitive to the price. And budget. So budgeting is something who it would be quite individual, right? You would have to look at the prices, say if you have time of use, and decide what is required, what is not required for you. And the second question really is a personal answer, which each individual will have to decide, or each household will have to decide, or each industry will have to decide at what is the value that they have from savings. Nitin has a question, or Dr. Abha, will you moderate the session from now
Yes,
on,
yes,
or
I will. I will. Thank you so
so you
much,
can
sir.
take
Thank you for your
questions?
talk, and I think you can take a water break also. Uh,
Yeah.
yes, thank you. Thank you. You must be tired. Mr. Nitin Sabeki, please go ahead with your question. You may switch on your microphone and ask the question. Mr. Nitin, you've raised your hand. I believe you'd like to ask a question. There is a microphone button on the screen which you need to switch on to ask the question. Or you could type it. I leave it to you.
Yeah.
Any other questions that we can take?
Was I that clear?
I think Mr. Nitin is reconnecting. In the meantime, if
Okay.
somebody else, another participant has a question, we'll be very happy to take that.
Okay, Ritu has a question.
Yes, Ritu.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pradyumna, for the presentation. It was really good. So I want to understand from your experience, which country do you think is the most efficient in the tariff determination process? Which one has the most efficient system?
Uh, coming from somewhat of a neoliberal, can you hear me? Coming from some sort of a neoliberal economics background, I would always say the countries which have liberalized the most have benefited from it. You can see. I can give you examples because I'm close to Europe, right? So they have, and especially in Scandinavia, they have done a great job, especially with going all the way from wholesale markets, which they've had for years, with Nord Pool, right up to delineation of your distribution, transmission, and retail, and having vibrant retail competition, and then having going really further up and being very brave in terms of implementing complex systems very quickly. But of course, they have a lot more money than a country like India, so they can roll out. For instance, France is rolling out smart meters across the country. Boom, you know. So they do amazing things. So there is a constraint everywhere. So you cannot say some country is better than another. I think everywhere regulators are working very hard. I think it's one of the hardest jobs, and watching them closely and talking and interacting with them, I see it's a very, very hard job to juggle between being independent, between working with the governments, with the industry, and also making sure that what their basic role is to have the people, the best of the people in their mind or in their actions all the time. So I would say all regulators are doing well in terms of tariff design. All regulators are doing well within the constraints that they have. Um, but some have had more flexibility to experiment. So that way, you would see some countries in Scandinavia or even Australia. Australia also, they're doing really well. They have the NEM, the National Energy Market. They have even something interesting which I didn't look at in this research, but is Singapore in the Southeast Asian context. Singapore has surrounded by countries which are vertically integrated, which are relatively not economically well off. Singapore is doing very well. It's a small, tiny city state, but they have a market. They have interconnections with I think Malaysia. It's Malaysia about them, right? Yeah, Malaysia. They are part of a huge grid network project which goes right across Asia to build transmission lines. So I can give you many examples of good things that many different regulators have done across the world, and there's a lot to learn. Maybe a lot to learn even from Indian regulators who are here today. Uh, for instance, India is going big on rooftop solar or on pushing renewables, which we are doing very well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhagwat. I see a
Yeah.
few raised hands. Mr. Saurabh is there,
Yes.
but before that, also, I think I missed somebody.
Okay, there's Akash.
Saurabh ji, would you like to speak into the microphone? Yes, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Saurabh from IX. My question to Dr. Pradyumna is, if he can put some light on the way countries have transitioned from a regulated structure to a market-based structure. What are the typical asking this from India's perspective, obviously, but
Yeah,
what key points if you can put?
I
Basically,
would I would say, sorry.
primarily at the retail level. Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
I would say I would request Dr. Abha to have another webinar with me on this topic, because we are talking something which is very close to my heart, having worked on a PhD which is all about wholesale markets and capacity mechanisms. But um, I would say from the European experience, shifting from at a wholesale level, which is a question for IEX, right? Shifting from power purchase agreements, long-term power purchase agreements to more short-term market-based instruments, something that's happening right now with RTM and everything, has happened over time, and different countries have used different approaches. Some even like Germany going in for grandfathering of these contracts, so allowing them to participate in the market and paying that extra amount, while others have first a lot of them started by moving from physical contracts to financial contracts, and then and routing everything through the wholesale market. And then the next step was also interlinking of the market. So you had one common price which is set across Europe, because we want to go towards a single market in the EU. For instance, then something like a Nord Pool or a GME or a EAX collects the price and clears it together, or through Euphemia, which is the famous software that many softwares in the world are based on. Um, but that is more of a question. But for a retail level, I could say that there was strong push for unbundling during the third package of EU, and this unbundling basically meant that distribution was delineated from retail. And when distribution gets delineated from retail, you have retail players who come into the picture, and each of these players then can participate and buy electricity from the wholesale market. So you will have large consumers and retailers buying electricity from the wholesale market, and that's how the trade begins. And then these retailers will make this into products and sell these products to the consumer and make the margin on that. So it's a very low margin. So you need to be retailers with very low margin and high number of customers. So there is a lot of retail competition, and then there is of course retail shifting. So you will have an NG, or you will have so many other companies which would give you different choices, and then you choose what electricity and needs that you need. And many times electricity and gas needs are combined together. So you have products which would say, I will pay X unit for electricity, Y unit for gas from this company, or X and Y from another company, and then you can make a choice between your companies. And that's one of the things I spoke about, which is consumer choice. And what happens once you have retail competition is that the retailers are trading on the wholesale market, making it and buying from there, or buying from PPAs or wherever they are. But they have to give the consumer a lot of choice, like we have with mobile phones. I mean, with now it went to almost free. The whole thing went to free. So and we might have somebody from telecom who knows much more about it, but that's what happens in retail eventually, that you have a lot of players participating. Very difficult for electricity to have too many players because it's a unique product, but we will see. And it's very high cost, but we might even have startups coming into the picture and really taking a big step in providing us with these services, provided that we have retail competition in India. Okay, I have
Thank you,
some
sir.
written questions here.
Yes.
So, in comparison with
Um,
the rest of the world, India has a complex tariff, so it means a lot of components in electricity. I would to Akash, I would say that I think all countries in the end have very complex tariff structures. I can share. I mean, right now I don't want to do it, but if you look at the Spanish system, which they have something like black energy charge, for instance. There are things like that. So each country, eventually it is basically the cost of energy, the cost of transporting the energy, cost of selling the energy, and a bit of profit, and taxes and levies. So I wouldn't say one country is more complex than the other. It's just the same, and that's why I said all regulators are working really hard. Does any country have experience of linking renewable charging, EV charging? Dr. Abha, very happy to talk about this whenever you want me to. but I can answer this quickly. There are many countries experimenting with this, especially with also rooftops. So Zevia, which is in France, for example, a company created by EDF, the big French behemoth, and what they are doing is they are doing rooftop solar and EV charging. So this is happening. There's also rooftops. There are tests for many years going on in the Fraunhofer Institute of rooftop solar to hydrogen and charging from that. So renewable to EV charging is happening in a lot of places. I think from India's perspective, our first step should be grid connected, because the grid service providers are also having RPOs now. Okay. Then there is dynamic tariffs would have following challenges, but there is nothing written there. So,
There is, sir, ahead, I think there's written putting up infrastructure, passing on subsidy. Domestic consumers are hugely cross-subsidized. These are the challenges
okay.
that Mr.
Yeah,
Agarwal.
yeah, yeah. Indeed, and I think I did identify these, and I think the new what I can say is to Mr. Agarwal's point, to react to it, is that that the new amendment which is coming in, which is going to be very helpful in terms of the fact that then companies will have the money on their own balance sheets rather than having subsidies coming in, and then the subsidy with the DBT especially. And I think the DBT is a great idea, because then you can actually have retail competitions where retailers get paid, and then the consumers also can be protected. But in terms of dynamic pricing, yes, if you're getting subsidized, then you're reducing the incentive to change, because then you have no incentive to switch, because you're anyway subsidized. Somebody else is. It's like flying business class on your holidays versus flying business class when you're going for work. You at least wait 2 minutes and think 2 times. When you're on holidays, it goes out of your own pocket. It's the same thing. It's the same way. And putting up of
Then there's a question
infrastructure.
about, sorry, I interjected, but something about shadow billing before actual, there's a question by shadow billing before actual implementation of the TOU.
Yeah, I mean, by shadow billing, I understand that you mean some sort of test to see how things work. And I'm a big believer in doing sandboxing. I think regulatory and technology sandboxing go hand to hand. One of the things I always talk about, and I like to talk a lot about, is that we should, and in India especially, we have the capacity and the capability to do these sandboxings of taking small pieces of districts and testing out solutions which are not just technology solutions but the regulatory solutions, and what are the regulatory flexibilities that would be required for new technical solutions to be implemented, and test them in a very small way before rolling them out. And I think we should, we have a lot of regulators here, very happy to talk with any of you on this topic, but I think it's super important and needs to be done, especially with charging infrastructure rollout, with storage, with dynamic tariffs, all these future topics, peer-to-peer trade, communities, community electricities. Okay.
There was a question that we missed. Mr. Akash is asking, in comparison to the rest of the world, does India have a complex tariff scheme? Means a lot of component in tariff, or other countries are also on the same path?
Yeah, I did answer this actually at the just 1 moment ago, but I'll repeat it. What I think is that not all, I mean, all countries have complex tariffs. In the end, it's the same thing, right? In the end, there is transmission. In the end, there is generation. In the end, there is retail. In the end, there is taxes. In the end, there is some sort of subsidy. So complexity, it's important to work with complexity. And I think there is no country which is more or less complex, but the key is transparency. That how transparent are you in telling everybody, telling the world, telling your consumers, telling the people, how are you setting this tariffs? What are the issues that you're taking into consideration? So it's more to do with transparency than complexity. Complexity can be dealt with if you're transparent about it, if you put everything on a piece of paper.
Right. Thank you, sir. Dr. Garg, do we have a question from you?
Yeah, I was only trying to put one sentence that
Yes, sir.
energy all over the world, it is a socio-political energy pricing which is dynamic over a small period between two elections. And between two elections, between two extreme weathers, this whole thing goes for a toss and remains more of an academic exercise. It has to be dynamic, varying, as I said right in my first comment, varying within a state for different industries, different users, different areas, different industries, and so on. So that's where, yes, the logics are good, the concepts are good, they lead us to a direction, but within a period, stable period between two elections.
I would react. I would react to this. That I would say from practice, it's been. It's and I can answer you from practice, right? That at least in terms of, I wouldn't say I'm like a proponent of dynamic tariffs or proponent of one thing over another, because after a point, I mean, I believe in being astute and taking sides depending on in a way value of a issue that we're looking at. But from the dynamic tariff perspective, indeed, we are, because I'm just keeping the focus to that, because this topics what you're talking about, we can go on for half an hour with my reply. But I would say that yes, indeed, it will be a futile exercise if you do not consider a lot of other flexibilities that exist around. So if you put everything firmly, and then everything will work, right? And then you move something a bit, everything starts to fall apart. And that is where, and that is why I keep saying that we need to do sandboxing. We need to know when does it start to fall apart, and the moment, and then we can actually put in robust mechanisms like it has been done across the world. And I will tell you a negative example of this was the 2000 crisis in California, where the retailers basically went completely bust. They had to stop retail competition because what the reason for that was clear, that when you don't, and that is one of my on the slide which I say that a social, and like you said, socio-economic, technico-economic. So I said we need to do a social cost benefit analysis in the beginning. We have to first do a social cost benefit analysis of applying dynamic tariffs or not before we even move into the idea of applying it. And one part of the social cost benefit analysis can be a practical application in terms of a sandbox in a small region which has a good mix of people we are targeting for the dynamic tariff, and see how it works. So that way you have a lot of safety nets which can be put into place. So I wouldn't say that it's just an academic exercise, because it has worked across the world. It's more about application. If you do an haphazard application, nothing is going to work. I have a lot of all of us have seen in India a lot of examples of haphazard application of regulation, or the lockdown, for instance, itself. I liked the way it was implemented, but there the issue was about people following it. But in general, we need to be careful, think why we need it, start from the why, not because the whole world is doing it, right? And go on and see that is it required today or is it required in 10 years time. And this only comes when you do a cost benefit analysis.
Just one small observation. Among the telecom tariffs, as a result of competition, the tariffs came down and then they started increasing. In solar and renewable, as a result of competition, the tariff came down. But in the thermal and hydro, despite competition, the tariffs have started increasing.
I can.
Now, how do we reconcile this?
So the thing is, I'll tell you what happens with first you said telecom, right, and solar. So with telecom, yes, it's a clear-cut sign, because there was one large market participant who was just going for the new way of doing business, which I don't know. It's very strange, but it's a new way of doing business where you just burn through your capital and you get market share, right? So it was an aberration. Similarly with solar and wind, you see the tariffs going down sometimes too, and you are a regulator. I'm sorry to be a bit candid here. There are other regulators, but you see sometimes they are going down to unrealistic level. Are they really valid at that level? It's you are making these big charts about 10 saal ke baad, the price of solar will drop, and then I will start making money, and all these sort of and you have seen companies go bust in the solar space. I have my fingers and toes and nose everything crossed that that the solar revolution in India doesn't go bust, and the government of India doesn't have to come in with 1,000 or 10,000 crore package for having this. But and these numbers are something which the companies have, so they think they are going to be profitable. I will believe it only when it's built and it's being pushed into the the profits show. So you have to see that each one has its own peculiarity. With the solar and the wind renewables, I can tell the peculiarity is this: looking ahead and see the technology costs dropping, because we have scales, economies of scales, and consumption increasing, and growth of economic growth, etc. So these are all these financial wizardry which people do on Excel sheets. We will see. I hope it works. I hope it's great and it's perfect, and we have that sort of renewable push. And what happens with thermal is that in the case of thermal, lot of costs get added on, and which should be. It's because we need to kick out carbon-based generation from our system in the end, eventually, for sustainability reasons and for just not having your CO2 emissions. But they get loaded on because they have risks of coal, they have risks of gas, which are still being taken care of in India. I mean, from the ground, they have carbon taxes, some sort of levies. So with that, the prices will go up. And what happens is their running hours are reducing. And once their running hours reduce, they need more money to be viable. And this is the problem which was seen in Europe, currently being seen. It's called the missing money problem as such. And this is what capacity mechanisms have been put into place in Europe, for which you have to remunerate, because they had so much decommissioning of thermal power plants. They were afraid that they wouldn't have flexible peaking capacity in the end. And when you don't have flexible peaking capacity, you can just have a shutdown of the grid. So they actually have these mechanisms, capacity mechanisms in place to remunerate some generations at the peak to survive. And this happens because the renewables are cutting into the load duration curve and the price curve of the of the market and of the thermal generators. So that's how you have to reconcile. I mean, I tried very shortly to combine it, but it have different, really different industries, and each one has its own peculiarities, as you saw that each one had its own issues.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for your observations, Dr. Garg, and thank you for your answers, Dr. Bhagwat. I think this has been a very interesting sectoral talk, one of the few which has focused on a sectoral regulator and on a subject specific issue, electricity sector specific issue. We're very thankful to you, Dr. Bhagwat, for enlightening us on so many issues and bringing actually on the table the practitioners and the academicians' point of views. And that, I think, is exactly the kind of interplay that is needed, that, not everything is theoretical. Some kind of a balanced approach is needed to bring normalcy in the otherwise skewed markets. All kinds of problems that are there need a balanced approach. Thank you so much, sir. And a lot of requests are coming for your slides and your presentations, and we'll be happy to share with the participants the same. On behalf of IICA, on behalf of the School of Competition Law and the Forum of Indian Regulators, I would like to thank Dr. Bhagwat for being with us today and taking time out, sir. I know that you're busy, and this was the only time that we could, get from you today. Thank you, sir. I'd like to thank all the participants for making this session such a lively one, and for being patient listeners. It's not easy to be sitting, in front of the computer in a virtual platform. It is difficult. So thank you so much. This can only happen because you're passionate about the subject, because you want to know more, and thank you for your ideas. Please keep writing to us at the school, and if we can help you in any manner, we will surely get back to you. If you have any suggestions, please write to us. If you have any observations, anything that you'd, that will help us grow and do better. And Dr. Bhagwat, of course, has thrown light on some more subjects that are close to his heart, and he can speak further and interact with us further. Thank you so much, sir. Again, I extend my warm thanks to you on behalf of all of us. And thank you for my team for making this a success. Everybody at the school, Ritu, Aruni, Tarun, and Avnish. You have done a fabulous job. A lot of logistics are required to bring all people on one platform, online platform. Thank you, Dr. Bhagwat, and thank you to all the participants.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abha. And good to see you. And thank you to all the participants. And to Mr. Goyal as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.